What can we do to prevent against bone fractures? There was a study that came out recently saying vegans have more bone fractures. What do you think about this?
I don't. But let me go back to this. What do we need to do to prevent? That's an important part. What do we need to do to prevent bone fractures? Number one is we need to prevent falls, right? So besides the second part of the question, let's talk about the first part of the question. Is right now there's a big push in America, right, that most people take bone drugs, right, bisphosphonates in these injectable forms or oral forms. So we've been giving it for about 30 years now. The rate of hip fracture has still basically remained static. Okay, hasn't changed. And so we have to look at, like, what are we doing? Can we increase bone density with some of these drugs? Yes. Is it significant enough to prevent them from having the fracture? No. It improves bone density, but it doesn't improve falling. Even when they take the natural therapies, because we have natural therapies, by the way, that can increase bone density. My partner, her bone density increased 8% in 1 year, right? So yay, it's like almost 7 times higher than what the drugs can give, right? So we still got to follow it. But that doesn't prevent you from falling. The main thing that prevents you from breaking your hip is doing what we call yoga, is doing stretching, is doing flexion. Most Americans, unfortunately, and Europeans as well, when we look at this data, especially from that study that was in the last part of that sentence there, that's looking at that vegans in England who are not taking adequate calcium or vitamin D. So if you look at any of the studies that show that if someone's vegan and they are taking in their diet the amount of calcium that they're supposed to be taking, like everybody else, and the amount of vitamin D, the everybody else, they actually don't have higher amount of hip fractures. They actually have lower. Okay, and they have a lower risk of every other disease combined, right? The other reason what they're saying is why they might have had more fractures is because in general, most people who are plant-based are thinner, right? Their BMI is lower, right? Right now in America, obesity is a problem. 75% of patients over 20 are overweight or obese. 42% are obese. 9% of Americans are morbidly obese. That's a BMI of over 40. That's having over 100 pounds over your base average, weight for your size. Okay. So those other risks of being heavier actually have a higher risk of death because you have higher risk of then heart attacks, because vegans don't really get that, right? Diabetes, vegans really don't get that, if they're, again, healthy eating vegans. I'm not talking about junk food vegans, right? But the idea is that, these are kind of studies that kind of push people to look at, like, oh my God, this is like headline news. Like they want to have the debate of like paleo or standard American diet or industry saying you need to eat more of this. We have to look at the other studies. So when we look at, there was 3 other studies since that study that came out, which was reviews of all the literature, okay? Not just this little Oxford study of England and all. And when they look at, for example, the patients in the studies, in the vegan studies in Asia, okay, like Indonesia and Vietnam and, other parts of India and all stuff like that, they don't have that hip fracture increase. And the reason that we're looking at is it because they're stronger? No, is that they're doing daily exercises that prevent them from falling. So in the United States, for example, the people that I see fall and break their hip fractures are people who exercise a lot too. Because, we're doing stair steppers, we're doing, treadmills, we're doing all these things that are kind of mechanical, but they're not real. Right. So you do a stair stepper, it's a calibrated height. So they're just training their body to go on the stair or just a treadmill, but we're not walking on uneven earth, which is like, your yard, a trail, a path, a street, a track kind of thing. We always want to be walking, and you want to be doing flexible extension exercise. So those people who do yoga, for example, like China, the largest country of population in the world, India, the second, they don't have this hip fracture problem as we do. And they don't have, millions, they have millions more women and millions more people who are elderly. And yet we don't see this, we need to give bisphosphonate to all these people. We need to do bone density. Why? Is because they're always doing flexion, extension, exercise. The toilets are on the floor. They sit on the floor. I mean, my grandmother, until the day she passed, she could sit and do yoga. And my grandfather, same thing. They were more flexible. And then when I used to go visit them in India, I'd be the only American that have to bring a chair, into the room, which is embarrassing in a whole room of hundreds of people. Say we're at the temple or we're going to a festival, is because, I can't sit on the floor for 6 hours a day, like I'm not as flexible as those people in those cultures, because they're used to that. They're used to like sitting down, getting up. And so what happens by doing that flexion extension, they have mobility. Even Tai Chi, even Qigong has been shown to prevent hip fractures. So when we look at like 200-300 million people who do that every day in China, they don't have the hip fracture. The data shows that. So these are simple measures that we should be looking at before we even talk about like drugs or herbs. We're looking at, well, are you still able to bend down and tie your shoes? without falling over. Other common aspects of hip fractures is that most people trip over dogs. Most people have, terrible slippers that they got for Christmas. Most people have carpets in their house that are not like kind of sealed down. So like what happens is for most people who fall and break their hip, it's like, okay, I'm going to the bathroom in the middle of the night. I don't want to turn on the lights. I'm wearing my slippers and it catches on the end of the rug and it flips. I fall down and I break my hip. So, what are we doing for that? Right. So the main thing is that we have to look at, are we doing physical exercises that are actually balancing and strengthening our cerebellar aspect of understanding balance, and flexion and extension, understanding, again, balance in terms of like not falling over and having that ability to not fall. Most people who do these kind of standard exercises, they actually will fall. So when I see a patient and they might go to the gym all the time and they fall and they break their hip, they trip over something. It's always like in the parking lot at the grocery store. I was just stepping up, because not all steps are also made correctly, right? So if it's a little bit off or a little bit rock on the parking lot, they fall, even though they might be physically fit. So we have to understand that, we have to look at those aspects. Now, going back to the bone drugs actually improve the bone density, but they don't improve the bone strength, right? And so there's a higher risk of what they call spiral fractures that are occurring in women. And so we have to understand, the other aspect of looking at that is that there's natural therapy. So there's a study that just came out recently. We have a product that's a Chinese herbal product, and they actually did a study comparing it to the Fosamax. It was a blinded study, and they actually gave, here's the Fosamax and here's the Chinese herb. They did the bone density, and after a year, the Chinese herb just did just as well as the Fosamax without the side effects. So is there things to help naturally that can increase bone density? Yeah. Do we top it off with other things that are also in the literature to show that? Yes. Is that the only thing? No, because you still have to do these balancing and strengthening exercises, because you can still fall, right? You can still have these issues. So now the other aspect is, when we look at those people who are not vegan, for example, say somebody's eating a standard American diet, we have to look at the aspect that the highest country, we're in one of the top 3 countries that has the highest dairy consumption, right? So the higher the dairy consumption, the higher the osteoporosis. So, when we're looking at, okay, they're looking at the small amount, and then the vegans were under 2,000 people in the study, by the way, okay? But when we look at the population right now, 99% of Americans aren't plant-based. But who's in the hospital right now that has hip fractures? Those people, right? So it's not that they got protected or had extra benefits. The inference from that question is that they're saying that, oh, if you eat this other way, you're doing better. But in fact, that may not be the case, because in 30 years, that hasn't been shown to be true. So anyways, that's my answer for bone density issues and fractures.